This is an article which was written by Manly P. Hall for the PRS, Philosophical Research Society, Journal, number 5001, in spring 1990.
Genteel ladies of the 19th century were prone to discuss their symptoms. These were vague variations indicating unknown possibilities of minor physical ailments. In those days even the medical diagnosis had a tendency to be vague, and it was customary to assume that things would right themselves in due time. The political climate was extremely changeable, and great discussions seldom led to stressful consequences. The prevailing uneasiness did not often interfere with the broad patterns of living. It was useful, however, to scatter anxieties by the generous dispensing of spring tonics. Sulfur and molasses were a strong defense against lassitude, and a spring cleaning improved the atmosphere of the home. Scarcely a day went by that did not interfere with the simple joys of Victorian tranquility. When my grandmother was suffering from la grippe, the news spread rapidly and trusty remedies were in order. If pain lasted for several days, folks would say, something must be done about it. The family physician was called in, bringing with him an atmosphere of majestic sufficiency. Most ailments received only local notice. Books on health were few, and the vast complex of pharmaceutical houses had not developed to provide remedies for all ailments, real or imaginary. One thing was certain, however: when a person suffered discomfort something had to be done about it. No one wished to ache or shiver or find their bodies racked with ailments. It is different, though, when Mother Earth gets sick. It has been suffering for ages, and it is assumed that miseries must be expected and endured. The Egyptian physician of 3000 BC classified diseases under 3 headings. He declared that certain disorders of the flesh could be cured in a reasonable length of time. These symptoms and their consequences were, therefore, catalogued as type 1. Experience had shown that in most cases medical treatment would be adequate. The second type of sickness is more difficult and taxes the knowledge of the practitioner. The Egyptian physician said that he would strive to find a proper remedy, but the ends were uncertain. The third and last type of physical infirmities was simply listed as incurable and must be endured. In China the medical practitioner did not enjoy the complete confidence of the patient, especially if it was a lady. Physical examination was impossible, and the doctor carried around with him a little miniature ivory figure of the female body covered with various markings and symbols. The sick person pointed out on the ivory figure where the pain was, and the doctor prescribed accordingly. Perhaps what we need today is a science of political medicine which can be compiled from tens of thousands of case histories, checked and rechecked by observation and experience, and, in a sense at least, be diagnosable. If a person has a sour stomach or an outbreak of shingles, treatment is immediate and continues as long as necessary. If a planet suffers from an obviously dangerous ailment, it is ignored for thousands of years and there is no intelligent treatment. There is no misfortune that occurs to a planet and the creatures inhabiting it that cannot be successfully treated and, in most cases, completely cured. Mother Earth has an excellent basic physique. It is sustained by universal energy, as has been observed by countless scientists and philosophers. The mid-Victorian lady often liked to appear delicate. If she ailed just a little, there was additional sympathy for her needs and anxieties about her constitution. The earth is in trouble, not because of the forces and powers that fashioned it but from the constant abuse to which it has been subjected for ages. All the living creatures that inhabit the earth have been wisely adapted to the needs of the environment. Consider for a moment war as a type of a common cold. It is contagious and possibly infectious. It may begin with sniffles and end with the destruction of a civilization. It causes infinite suffering, frustrates all significant projects, breaks every rule, human and divine, and is allowed to run its course to the destruction of all concerned. Where an evil exists and the correction of that evil is obviously available, why should the remedy never be applied? A cold may drift into the flu and take on the seriousness of influenza or pneumonia. The world is in large part made up of persons who will take remedies for common infections but will do nothing to correct a plague infinitely more terrible than that which took millions of lives in Europe and Asia between the 13th and 16th centuries. Chronic indigestion results from bad eating habits. When the stomach starts aching, pain causes a minor curtailment of indigestibles. The Medes and the Persians suffered from a strain of political indigestion, passed it on to the Greeks and Romans, from whom it was bestowed upon the Renaissance, and then it was handed on to the present century with no major remedy in sight. Yet, there is nothing about political misconduct that is doomed to prove fatal. There are many persons who are fully aware of what is necessary, but it is a little like indigestion because a cure would interfere with average eating habits which, in turn, would strike a mortal wound in current dietetic practices and the distribution of junk foods. Today, a world in which we should be enjoying the wisdom of 100 ages is dying or threatened by enforced ignorance. There is no reason to doubt that we could properly educate our children if we actually wanted them to learn the facts of life. We know that crime will exist until the causes are corrected, so a psychology of life is perpetuated which can never produce anything except trouble, and we are aware of this. With the narcotic problem, decisive action has been a little late, because there was no intention of curing it unless it became incurable. In order to make sure that the narcotic traffic will not be permitted to die in its own misery, it is constantly protected both by the producer and the consumer through the building of a wall of hard cash. Most social evils would lose their powers if their funds were sharply reduced. Is there a cure for smog? There is a cure for every mistake resulting from human ignorance and perversity. The problem is that the alcoholic would rather die than stop drinking, and the cocaine addict wants to be the master of the universe for a few minutes before he disappears from his realms of fantasy. When appetites become so exaggerated that gratifying them threatens survival, it is time to face the hard facts. How did it all start? Pre-human beings huddled in caves and finally came out and took a look at the world around them. They failed, however, to explore the world within themselves. You can know all things, but, if you do not know your own origin, destiny, and purpose, your ignorance remains the dictator of your destiny. It has been said that the great Earth Mother has shaken countless civilizations from her back. There is a protecting power within ourselves which can rise to meet the challenge of our ignorance. Nature does not destroy itself, and the few regions that remain in at least a semi-natural condition are not exploited except when man moves in. Efforts to hazard universal laws have always proven a grave mistake. We survive by obeying the laws of our kind. The prevailing situation has gradually developed into a Gordian knot. Tangle has been added to tangle, mistakes have been multiplied and been accepted as realities, and nearly every phase of human life is involved in a deterioration tragic to behold. But it is not given that the great plan of universal life can be destroyed by creatures who have catered to their own notions so long that they believe the lies they tell to themselves and each other. In this world, what is important? Propagation brings in streams of incarnating souls, who are few of years and of many troubles. Conspiracies are created, but their originators do not even live long enough to contemplate the results. A lifetime is spent gathering worldly goods, paying taxes on possessions that are never possessed, and exhausting the surplus gratifying appetites that destroy the fool's paradise about which the self-deluded are so proud. The statement is perfectly true. What fools these mortals be! And, sad to say, the most affluent and respected institutions of learning we have established seldom impel us to correct faults or strengthen virtues. Nature intended that all its creations should be equipped with the potentials of intelligence and integrity. Unfortunately, the physical environment over-influences the infant from the moment of birth or even before it is born. Civilization as we know it is a destroyer of values, rather than the protector of ideals and dedication to right purposes and projects. Consequently, the infant has little opportunity to express its inner potentials. It would seem that the young child is drowned in a sea of troubles before it can express the higher aspects of its nature. In fact, it is a mistake to pass judgment upon any generation as better than another because the untutored mind is contaminated before it is incorporated into our social structure. The heavy atmosphere of selfishness, self-interest, and self-destruction begins with the first breath. We all know this, but there are very few who are strong enough to go against the tides of false knowledge passed off as genuine enlightenment. Today's music gives us some understanding of present conditions. The primitive rhythms which have descended from antiquity may seem strange to modern ears, but there is a certain inspirational quality that is meaningful to those who accept and understand the principles which originated in the pulse beat of the human heart or other physiological pressures of bodily tensions. Probably the safest forms of music are simple melodies and rhythms which quiet the emotions and bring peace to the mind. It is true that the labors of classical composers are not widely appreciated. Great music is pleasing only to those who value a profound beauty which uplifts the spirit of the listener and are able to recognize the extraordinary skill of the orchestration and the inspired genius of the composers. In this country, music was originally religious or recreational. The church choir got together the best voices of the community, and family gatherings around the old upright piano were a continuing source of mutual contentment. Gradually, the discords of Aboriginal songs and instrumental productions began to gain popularity because of the emotional tension which they created. The stress factor in jazz and hard rock transformed sound into a tonal menace to the integration of the human personality. It is not appropriate that civilized people should revert to primitive rhythms that might be suited to denizens of the Stone Age. Cultivating negative habits interrupts the growth of the human being and degrades those who fall victim to retrogressive dissonances. How does it happen that young people in particular are profoundly disturbed by the negative emotions generated by a kind of intoxication through the perversion of sound? There should be healthy outlets for adolescent emotions. The classic theater is better because of the emphasis upon discipline. Those who wish to raise the dance to the dignity of a great art must work diligently to control not only the body but the mind, as well. At the moment, there is a major renaissance in the dance systems of various countries, and it has already been demonstrated that this art can contribute a great deal to better understanding between the various religious, ethnic, and social groups that belong to the aesthetic traditions which form part of mankind's cultural and spiritual heritage. Why then has there been created a contemporary pattern of discordancies which are not only unpleasant but unhealthy? It would seem that appreciation for tonal beauty does not exist for many people at present. To accept the tonal catastrophe known as modern rock music, corruptions of sound are perpetrated that are dangerous to both health and morality. Many literally become addicts dedicated to tonal patterns which can inflict serious and permanent injury. By degrees there occurs a destruction of the internal censorship which was intended to protect the inner life from the tragic discords in what passes for modern music. As in all other compromises with integrity, the original purpose of art has been lost. There has been a gradual lowering of aesthetic standards especially in the present century. The desire to restore a useful and workable civilization is rapidly fading out. Generations are born which have known very little peace or honesty or kindness. Many no longer look forward to a career and a substantial retirement when their days of labor have ended. We all look forward to better times but do not do much to improve ourselves or the world society. Some now simply take it for granted that they will continue annoyed, discontented, and endangered as long as they remain here. Once a bad habit takes over, the willpower necessary to correct it gradually diminishes, and another life is ruined. There is no reasonable way that we can reform humanity by legislation. It seems impossible that the present trend can be altered without an act of providence. If this is true, then the corrections required will be allotted, but under more painful circumstances. Nature has no intention of permitting humanity to die. At the present time, humanity is in the most severe crisis recorded in the histories of the world. If we go on as we are, we could theoretically depopulate the planet, but this is not nature's plan or purpose. It is a direct result of human corruption and the gradual failure of the mental processes which has made possible the reasonable interpretation of available facts. Nature, however, does not operate that way. The purpose of experience is not to destroy the human race. Though nations continue to damage each other, securities of all kinds fade away, the financial future is too bleak to contemplate, and in the midst of it all there are attempts to discover how to perpetuate indefinitely the miseries which are now accepted as normal. If the truth were known, many would rather accept the afflictions which now plague them than attempt a reformation which might end in a dreary honesty which few wish to contemplate. What a large number of people really want, is to do what they please without fear of punishment in a world which is generally assumed to be the perfect environment for growing humankind. The gambler still wishes to place his bets, as long as there is a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he can win. We might ask one of the leaders of modern times, how should we begin the noble labor? In almost any direction one can turn, the elements of world affairs are so interlocked, that very little can now be done to change things for the better. Somewhere in the course of ages there has come an acceptance of the false conclusion that private careers can continue to be built in an environment that is intended solely for the advancement of all people in their various estates and purposes. In other words, we must rise together to new heights or fall in a structure in which there is no hope of survival. We can no longer become successful in a situation in which success is impossible. The number of people in the world frightens us as we approach 6 billion. It is, therefore, likely that there are still too many people, happy to live beyond their means or build their wealth in an atmosphere of abject poverty. It is strange that so many of us will die for our opinions but would never think of sacrificing life for the preservation of principles. Another problem that is more or less a throwback to ancient times is the fascination for human destruction. Down through the ages wars, great and small, have always appeared as mutilations on the pages of history. At one time there may be several great wars and in other periods a single conflict, but either way millions suffer and die. The dead can no longer complain, and the living divide the spoils. Human life is not very valuable these days, and, if we do not value the survival of others, we cannot expect much consideration for our own survival. We read of a village where a petty dictator has exterminated half the population, and in the same paper there are pictures of marching legions, hundreds of thousands ready to die who have not actually lived. If we do not value the life of our neighbor, why should we really be jealous of his possessions? Many are content to believe that half of the infants now being born into the world will die from the public crime of war or the private crime of mob violence. Thinking about these things, some are despondent and inclined to take refuge in small escape mechanisms. After reading the accounts of genuine crimes in the daily press, the public is offered on television horror films to take their minds off of the possibility that they may become the next victims of one kind of hatred or another. Now let us think for a moment of architecture. Most of us have traveled some or watched period films on television. One of the beauties of the past has been the graceful inspired forms of great houses. The dignified residences of the landed gentry set in colorful gardens are in some way an invitation to serenity. Of course, many do not have such houses and may be a little jealous, but many of these great estates are now owned by the public. The beauty of the Greek columns, the spires of great cathedrals and their stained glass windows, and even the old inns with their quaint wooden sidings seem to agree with a quietude and a security which we no longer enjoy. In America particularly, the pleasant houses of the 18th and 19th centuries are fading away. They are being torn down, and in their places stand condominiums, rows of boxes with barely space to park a car between them. There is not one touch of beauty but all utility, and, if some fantastic project allows a little artistry, it is apt to be so contemporary that it resembles a stack of scrap metal or stones. Our public buildings look like banks, while some of our modern buildings resemble stock exchanges and others are suspended in a futuristic atmosphere that brings neither comfort nor inspiration. The Greeks emphasized that the city beautiful must be preserved. It must always bear witness to the good in man, his hopes, his dreams, and his aspirations. Instead of that, the modern environment is a cluttered assortment of the bad and the indifferent. The great building which has cost millions casts its long shadow over squalor and despair. The city is a collective symbol of the chaos which dominates the inner life of so many people. Not long ago, I dropped into a recently finished church. It was an expensive building, and the materials were costly and somewhat overdone. The structure as a whole, however, resembled the Senate chamber of a small country, and in an atmosphere completely void of inspiration it was hoped that man might strengthen his faith by admiring a product of materialism. We now see special trips on television into the homes of the rich and famous and, occasionally, the infamous. There is no doubt in the world that large numbers of persons wish devoutly that they could live in such mansions and that wealth would bring them peace and freedom from responsibility. Nowhere was the simple, gentle feeling of home dominant in these houses. Most of them would pass as lobbies of expensive hotels. By perceptible stages the things that make for real growth and permanence are disappearing from our institutions. People are still expected to moralize these things, but their moralities have gone to sleep. It is all part of the great struggle from the cradle to the grave and is certainly not the original design of the supreme power that orders the world. One of the simplest of these little problems is the restaurant. Here in Los Angeles there used to be a small French café. The patrons were seated at long tables, and the common items were spread out with a pitcher of red wine at one end and white wine at the other with hors d'oeuvres and bread and rolls in various forms in between. The food was simple with 2 or 3 desserts, and the food was edible. In the old days it all cost $1, but I seem to remember that it got up into the $2 range before it disappeared from my lifestyle. Eating has become one of the prevailing tragedies of the day. It is perfectly possible to spend $40 or $50 for a dinner with special dishes, each one more indigestible than what went before. It has come about that when it was no longer known what to do with money it was decided to eat, which gives some idea of how really unimportant wealth can be. It does not make much difference which way you tum, extravagance reigns supreme. Fabulous salaries evaporate. Few people actually enjoy anything, but extravagant eating habits work a serious hardship upon the human body which must often cope with the neurosis of its owner. The meal itself is often a gastronomical disaster. The winers and diners are actually contributing to dyspepsia and an early death. Epicurism was for centuries associated with the aristocracy and the leisure class. Today there is a gross imitation of the bon vivant's tastes without the former cultivated refinements, but in each of these circumstances there has been a very definite contribution to ill health. Sandwich shops and short-order cafes have a great fascination, but very few of the diners actually know what they are eating. It is only in recent years that the American people generally are taking lessons in wiser eating and the more sensible preparation of foods. It is sad indeed that prosperity undermines the very security with which the concept is identified. On this subject most of the world is guilty of ignorance and indifference, but less up-to-date national and racial groups enjoy better health by clinging to their traditional diets. To say that these types of things can never be changed, that common sense can never return, and that the brotherhood of man is gone forever is simply not true. The time will come when we will all sit down to a simple meal, because as populations increase that is all that will be available. The simple life will come back by either intent or accident. Instead of being demoralized by shrinking extravagance, perhaps the human being can begin to live and grow as nature and nature's God intended.